Assalamualaikum and good morning. Today, I will be presenting a seminar on developing speaking skills among low proficiency ESL learners. Among the four language skills, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, speaking is often regarded as the most challenging, particularly for ESL learners with low proficiency in English. Unlike reading or writing, speaking requires learner to produce language spontaneously, in real time, and often in front of others. For many ESL learners, this creates a sense of pressure that can be overwhelming. So, in many classrooms, it is common to see learners who can understand instructions, complete written exercises, and even score reasonably well on tests, yet remain silent when asked to speak. This phenomenon, uh, this phenomenon raises an important question. If learners are exposed to English for years, why does speaking remain so underdeveloped? So, this seminar takes the position that the difficulty does not lie solely in learners' lack of grammar or vocabulary. Instead, it lies on effective factors, classroom practices, and how speaking is conceptualized and taught in ESL contexts. I will argue that developing speaking skills among low proficiency learners requires a shift from accuracy driven instructions to a more supportive, scaffolded, and fluent fluency oriented approach. So, the first one, my first point is understanding low proficiency ESL learners. To understand how to develop speaking skills, we must first understand the characteristic of low proficiency ESL learners. Low proficiency low proficiency learners typically possess limited vocabulary and incomplete grammatical knowledge. However, more importantly, they often lack confidence in their ability to communicate meaningfully in English. Many of them associate speaking with making mistakes, being corrected publicly, or being judged by peers and teachers. In addition, these learners often experience high level of anxiety, especially in classroom where speaking is treated as performance rather than communication. When learners believe that every spoken sentence must be grammatically correct, they may choose silence as a safer option. Another contributing factor is limited opportunity. In teacher-centered classroom, teacher talk, do- teacher talk dominates instructional time, leaving learners with minimal chances to practice speaking even when opportunities exist. They may be limited to short mechanical responses rather than meaningful communication. Therefore, low proficiency in speaking is not simply a linguistic issue. It is a complex interaction of emotional, social, and instructional factors. So the second one is speaking fluency versus accuracy. So one of the most debated issue in teaching speaking is the balance between fluency and accuracy. Accuracy refers to the correct use of grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. Fluency, on the other hand, refers to the ability to communicate ideas smoothly even if errors are present. In many ESL classrooms, accuracy is prioritized from the beginning. Learners are corrected frequently, sometimes even mid-sentence. While this approach is often well intentioned, it can unintentionally hinder speaking development, particularly for low proficiency learners. This seminar argues that prioritizing fluency in early stages of speaking development is more beneficial. When learners are when learners are encouraged to express meanings without constant interruption, they are more likely to take risks and participate actively. This does not suggest that accuracy is unimportant. Rather, Accuracy should be addressed gradually and strategically. Once learners have developed the confidence and willingness to speak, speaking speaking is a skill that improves through use, not avoidance. If learners are silenced by fear of error, accuracy becomes irrelevant because communication never happened. So, the third one is role of classroom environment. The classroom environment plays a crucial role in shaping learners' willingness to speak. A supportive classroom environment is one where mistakes are viewed as part of learning process rather than failures. In such environments, learners feel safe to experiment with language and express ideas, even imperfectly. Teachers play a key role in creating the environment through their responses to learner errors, their tone of voice, and their expectation. When teachers respond to errors with patience and encouragement, learners are more likely to continue speaking. Additionally, peer dynamic matters. Low proficiency learners may fear negative evaluation from classmates. Structured speaking tasks, such as pair or small group activities, it can reduce the pressure by limiting the audience and creating a sense of shared responsibility. A classroom that values effort and communication over perfection provides the emotional foundation necessary for speaking development. And next is strategies for developing speaking skills. Several instructional strategies can support the development of speaking skills among low proficiency ESL learners. First, scaffolding is essential. Scaffolding involves providing linguistic support that enable learners to participate in speaking tasks beyond their current ability. This can include sentence starters, model dialogues, and guided questions. Rather than limiting learners, scaffolding empowers them to express ideas with confidence. Second, low risk speaking activities. Um, Low risk speaking activities encourage participation. Low risk activity Low risk speaking activities encourages participation. Activities such as pair discussions, role plays, and short guided responses reduce anxiety by shifting the focus from public performance to private communication. These activities allow learners to practice speaking in manageable, supportive context. The third one is delayed error connection, which supports fluency. Instead of correcting learners during speaking, teachers can take note and provide feedback afterwards. This approach preserves the flow of communication while still addressing accuracy. And finally, positive and constructive feedback reinforces learners. It can reinforce learners' efforts. The positive and constructive feedback enforces learners' efforts. Feedback that acknowledge what learners do well while gently guiding improvement will build confidence and motivation. And together, these strategies create a balanced approach that supports both fluency and accuracy over time. Next is the teacher's role as a facilitator. In developing skills, in developing speaking skills, the role of teacher shifts from authority to facilitator. Rather than controlling every aspect of the classroom interaction, teachers can guide learners to teachers can guide learners by providing support and create opportunities for meaningful communication. This requires flexibility, sensitivity, and reflective decision making. And teachers must constantly negotiate between structure and freedom, correction and encouragement, and teacher control and learners' autonomy. There is no single method that works in all contexts. Instead, Effective teaching involves adapting strategies to learners' needs. So, as Friedrich Nietzsche once stated, there are no facts, only interpretation. Similarly, teaching speaking does not involve fixed rules, but from interpretations shaped by context, learners, and purpose. So, to conclude, developing skills among low proficiency ESL learners is a complex but achievable goal. It requires teachers to look beyond linguistic deficiencies and consider emotional, social, and pedagogical factors. By prioritizing by prioritizing fluency, creating supportive environments, and implementing scaffolding speaking strategies, teachers can help learners overcome fear and develop confidence. Speaking is not merely a product of knowledge, but a result of opportunity, encouragement, and trust. Thank you. I now welcome any questions, comments, or alternative perspectives.
So, you argue that fluency should be prioritized over accuracy for low proficiency learners. However, some educators believe that allowing learners to speak without correcting errors may fossilize incorrect language forms. In the long term, wouldn't this approach harm learners' language development rather than support it?
Well, that is a valid concern. And I agree that fossilization is a real risk. However, I will argue that fossilization occurs not because error are temporarily tolerated, but because they are never addressed systematically. My position is that accuracy should be delayed, not ignored.
But if learners repeatedly produce incorrect forms during speaking, won't those forms become habits that are difficult to change later?
Well, I understand that perspective. However, research and classroom practice suggest that learners are more receptive to correction after confidence is established. If learners are silenced early due to fear of errors, they may never reach a stage where accuracy can even be addressed.
Oh,
Any
okay.
other question?
There's another question.
Yes.
You recommend delayed correction during speaking activities, but in real classrooms with limited time, is delayed feedback practical, and how can teachers ensure learners actually notice and learn from their mistakes?
Okay, that is an important practical issue. Delayed feedback can be implemented through selective error focus. When teachers target recurring or serious errors rather than correcting everything.
Still, isn't immediate correction more efficient, especially for beginners who may not recognize their own mistakes?
While immediate correction may seem efficient, it often interrupts communication. I would argue that for beginners, maintaining the flow of speech is more beneficial and noticing errors can be enhanced through reflection activities after speaking.
Okay, so the next question is,
Yes.
what if low proficiency learners remain silent even when given sentence frames and low pressure tasks? Doesn't this suggest that speaking ability cannot be developed without forcing participations to some extent?
I would disagree with the idea of forcing participation. Silence may seem indicate anxiety, lack of readiness, or cultural expectation rather than unwillingness.
But if participation is always optional, how can teachers ensure learning actually takes place?
I believe participation can encourage without co- coercion. For example, teachers can gradually increase expectation, starting with minimal responses and slowly moving towards longer utterances.
Oh, I get that.
I think that is all the question.
Um, yeah, I think that is.
Okay, that is all for me. Thank you. Thank you so much for listening to my seminar. Thank you so much.
So now, welcome to my seminar. Good morning. Today I will be presenting a seminar on the use of first language of L1 in the ESL classroom. In the field of teaching English as a second language, few topics generate as much debate as the question of whether learners' first language should be allowed in the classroom. For decades, many language teaching approaches have promoted the idea that English should be the sole medium of communication. This belief is often grounded in the assumption that maximum exposure to the target language leads to faster and more effective acquisition. As a result, English only policies have become normalized in ESL contexts. Teachers are sometimes encouraged or even required to discourage any use of the learner's first language, regardless of proficiency level, task type, of or learning objectives. However, when we move from theory to actual classroom practice, especially in contexts involving low proficiency learners, this ideal becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Learners often rely on their first language to seek clarification, negotiate meaning with peers, or simply reduce anxiety when faced with unfamiliar content. This raises an important pedagogical question. Is the use of L1 a failure of teaching, or can it be a legitimate instructional resources? In this seminar, I will argue that the issue should not be framed on a strict choice between English only instruction and unrestricted L1 use. Instead, I propose that strategic, purposeful, purposeful and limited use of first language can support ESL learning, particularly on for low proficiency learners without without undermining the role of English in the classroom. To understand the role of first language in ESL learning, it is important to recognize that learners do not enter the classroom as empty vessels. They already possess a fully developed linguistic system in their first language. This system shapes how they process information, construct meaning, and interpret new input. From a cognitive perspective, learners naturally draw on existing knowledge when learning something new. When English proficiency is limited, the first language becomes a powerful tool for understanding instruction, making sense of abstract concepts, and also organizing thoughts. Despite this, first language has traditionally been viewed as a source of interference. Many educators worry that allowing first language use will prevent learners from thinking in English, slow down acquisition, or encourage dependency on translation. These concerns are understandable, especially in contexts where learners share the same first language. However, such assumptions often overlook the complexity of language learning. Rather than preventing acquisition, strategic L1 use can act as a scaffold, enabling learners to engage with tasks that would otherwise be inaccessible. This seminar, therefore, adopts the view that L1 is not inherently harmful. Its effectiveness depends on how, when, and why it is used. The English only approach is based on a clear and logical principle. Learners need exposure to English in order to acquire it. This principle has been supported by various theories of second language acquisition that emphasize input, interaction, and also output. However, the application of this principle in real classrooms often reveals limitations, particularly for low proficiency learners. When learners are exposed to large amounts of English that they do not understand, input becomes noise rather than meaningful language. In such cases, insisting on English only instruction may increase confusion, frustration, and also anxiety. Learners may disengage, remain silent, or rely on memorization without genuine understanding. Moreover, English only policies often assume that all learners are equally equipped to cope with immersion. The assumption ignores differences in proficiency, learning pace, and also effective factors. This seminar does not reject the value of English exposure. Instead, it challenges the assumption that more English is always better, regardless of context. Strategic L1 use can actually enhance the effectiveness of English input by ensuring comprehension and reducing cognitive overload. Beyond linguistic consideration, L1 use also plays a significant role in learners' emotional experiences. Low proficiency ESL learners often experience anxiety, particularly when asked to speak or perform tasks in English. Fear of making mistakes, being corrected publicly, or being judged by peers can lead learners to withdraw from participation altogether. In such contexts, limited use of L1 can serve as an emotional safety net. It allows learners to confirm understanding, seek reassurance, and participate more confidently in classroom activities. When learners feel psychologically safe, they are more willing to take risks in English. Therefore, strategic L1 use may indirectly promote English use by reducing fear and increasing willingness to communicate. This highlights an important point, which is language learning is not purely cognitive, it is deeply affective. Ignoring learners' emotional needs may undermine instructional goals. From a practical standpoint, L1 use also has implications for classroom management. In some situations, brief explanation in L1 can save time and prevent misunderstanding, especially when explaining complex instructions or abstract concepts. Rather than spending excessive time rephrasing instruction in English, teachers can ensure clarity and maintain lesson flow. However, uncontrolled L1 use can become problematic. Learners may over rely on their first language, reducing opportunities for English practice. Therefore, therefore, teachers must establish clear boundaries and expectations. This seminar argues that effective ESL teaching requires guided use of L1, not complete freedom or complete restriction. Teachers should model appropriate language choices and gradually encourage increased use of English as learners' proficiency develop. The role of the teacher is central in managing L1 use. Rather than enforcing rigid rules, teachers should act as mediators who make informed decisions based on learner needs, task objectives, and also classroom context. This requires reflection, flexibility, and also professional judgment. For beginner learners, L1 scaffolding may be necessary to build foundational understanding. As learners become more proficient, L1 support can be gradually reduced to encourage greater independence in English. This process resembles scaffolding, where support is removed once learners are capable of performing tasks independently. There is no universal formula for determining when L1 should be used. Effective teaching involves interpretation rather than strict adherence to ideology. As Friedrich Nietzsche famously stated, there are no facts, only interpretations. In TESOL, pedagogical decisions are shaped by context rather than absolute truths. To conclude, the use of first language in ESL classroom should not be viewed as a pedagogical failure. When used strategically and purposefully, L1 can support comprehension, reduce anxiety, and facilitate learning, particularly among low proficiency learners. At the same time, unrestricted use of L1 may limit exposure to English and hinder progress. Therefore, the goal is not to eliminate L1, but to balance its use with meaningful English interaction. Effective ESL teaching requires teachers to negotiate between theory and practice, structure and flexibility, and also exposure and support. Thank you for your attention. I now welcome questions, alternative perspective, and also opposing views.
Okay, so you argue that strategic use of L1 can be beneficial in ESL classrooms. However, many language acquisition theory emphasizes that maximum exposure to the target language. Doesn't allowing L1 contradict this principle and potentially slow down English acquisition?
Good question. And I agree that exposure is essential for acquisition. However, I would argue that exposure without comprehension does not lead to meaningful learning. Strategic L1 use can actually support understanding and make English input more effective.
But if learners know they can rely on L1, won't they reduce their effort to use English?
That risk exists if L1 use is unrestricted. However, when teachers clearly define when English is expected, L1 becomes a support rather than a substitute.
Okay, my next question is: isn't there a danger that frequent use of L1 will create dependency, especially among low proficiency learners who may avoid challenging themselves in English?
Hmm. I partially agree that dependency is a risk. However, I believe dependency results from lack of gradual withdrawal of support, not from L1 use itself.
How can teachers ensure that L1 support does not become permanent?
Teachers can gradually reduce L1 use as proficiency increases, similar to scaffolding, where support is removed once learners are more confident.
If learners frequently use L1 during pair or group work, how can teachers be sure that meaningful English practice is actually taking place?
That is a legitimate concern. However, task design plays a crucial role. Tasks with clear English output requirements encourage learners to switch back to English.
But isn't monitoring every group unrealistic in large classroom?
While constant monitoring is difficult, teachers can circulate selectively and reinforce expectations. Complete control may be unrealistic, but guided practice is achievable.
So my next question is: does allowing L1 undermine the teacher's authority or classroom discipline, especially in multilingual setting?
I would disagree with that assumption. Authority comes from clarity and consistency, not language restriction.
Then, how should teachers manage multiple first languages?
In multilingual classrooms, English may still dominate. However, brief L1 support among same language peers can still serve cognitive purposes without disrupting the class.
Okay, my last question is, if there is no clear rule on L1 use, how can teachers justify their choices academically?
Teachers justify their choices through learner needs, classroom evidence, and also reflective practice. As in many areas of TESOL effective teaching involves interpretation rather than rigid rules.
Okay, that is all my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to my seminar.
Thank you.